An 8-year-old girl's simple question silenced a crowded town hall and left Donald Trump sharing a deeply personal story about faith, loss, and redemption. What happened next moved everyone to tears. The Church Fellowship Hall in Shreveport, Louisiana, buzzed softly with the sounds of folding chairs scraping against the polished floor and murmured conversations. The space, usually reserved for Sunday potlucks and Bible studies, had taken on a different atmosphere that evening. At the front of the room stood Donald Trump. His unmistakable presence filled the modest hall. The familiar orange-tinted complexion and signature hand gestures were there, but tonight he seemed uncharacteristically subdued, perhaps sensing the weight of the moment. The audience was a mix of families, retirees, and curious locals eager to hear what he had to say. Yet, amidst the crowd, one figure stood out, not because of her size but because of her quiet intensity. 8-year-old Lily, dressed in her best Sunday dress, clutched an old, leather-bound Bible to her chest. The treasured book, passed down from her late grandmother, was worn, its gold lettering faded with time. Sitting beside her, Lily's mother had whispered before they arrived, "You can ask him, but only if you're brave enough, and only if you truly mean it." Lily had nodded, her heart pounding. She had been rehearsing her question for weeks, scribbling it in her notebook during recess and murmuring it to herself as she lay in bed at night. It wasn't a question born of simple curiosity but one that weighed deeply on her young soul. As the evening unfolded, Trump spoke on his usual topics, policies, achievements, and his vision for America's future. The crowd clapped occasionally, nodding in agreement, though the energy felt subdued compared to his typical rallies. Lily waited, her small hands gripping the edges of her Bible tighter with each passing minute. When the floor finally opened for questions, a line quickly formed. Adults eagerly stepped forward to ask about local issues, national policies, and even to offer compliments on his iconic red tie. Lily hesitated, shrinking into her seat. Her mother gave her a subtle nudge, and she knew it was her moment. Her legs wobbled as she stood, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. As she inched forward in the line, the chatter in the room began to quiet. By the time it was her turn, all eyes were on her, a small girl with an oversized Bible clutched to her chest. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Trump looked down at her, his expression softening in a way that seemed almost out of character. "And what's your question, young lady?" he asked, his voice surprisingly gentle. Lily swallowed hard, gripping her Bible so tightly her knuckles turned white. Then, with a trembling voice that refused to break, she asked the question that had echoed in her heart for months. "Mr. Trump, what does God mean to you?" The room fell into complete silence. Eyes darted between the little girl and the former president. The weight of her question pressed down on everyone like a palpable force. For a man known for his quick comebacks, Trump didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at her, then at the Bible in her hands. His usual bravado gave way to something softer, almost vulnerable. The seconds ticked by as he remained silent, the room thick with expectation. Finally, Trump took a deep breath. His voice, when he spoke, was uncharacteristically steady but laden with emotion. "God," he began, pausing as if choosing his words carefully, "means hope. He means forgiveness even when we don't deserve it. He means a second chance." The sincerity in his voice took the audience by surprise. Trump glanced at Lily again, his gaze lingering on the Bible. "There was a time in my life," he continued, "when I felt lost, like I didn't deserve redemption. But I learned that faith doesn't abandon us, even when we doubt ourselves. God doesn't abandon us." The room seemed to hold its collective breath. Tears glistened in the eyes of several audience members. Lily's own eyes welled up as she hugged her Bible closer. Trump finished with a soft smile, his voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for asking me that, Lily. You reminded me of something I think we all need to remember." The applause that followed was unlike anything he had heard at a rally, quiet, heartfelt, and genuine. For a brief moment, politics and divisions faded away, replaced by a shared sense of humanity. As Lily returned to her seat, her mother reached over to squeeze her hand. "You did good, sweetheart," she whispered. Lily nodded, a sense of peace settling over her. She had asked her question and found her answer, and in doing so, she had reminded an entire room of people about the power of faith. The crowd remained hushed. No shouted slogans, no murmurs, not even the creak of a chair or a muffled cough. It was as though the very air in the room was holding its breath. Trump finally raised his hand slightly, steadying himself, and leaned against the podium. "That's a big question," he began, his voice lower and steadier than usual. "And it's not one I've always had the answer to." The admission surprised many. Donald Trump, known for his unshakable confidence, was confessing uncertainty in front of a crowd. He looked back at Lily, and his expression softened, almost paternal. "When I was about your age," he continued, "I had a lot of questions about God too. My parents took me to church every Sunday. I remember sitting in those pews, staring at the stained glass windows, wondering if God was even listening to me." He paused, glancing out at the audience as though gauging their reaction. His hand rested on the edge of the podium, fingers tapping lightly against the wood. "My father used to tell me," he said, "that faith is like a ladder. You climb it one step at a time, and sometimes you're afraid you'll fall. But you keep climbing because there's something up there worth reaching for." He stopped, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "At the time, I didn't understand what he meant. I thought it was just something he said to keep me quiet." A ripple of laughter broke through the tension, softening the moment. But Lily didn't laugh. Her eyes stayed fixed on him, waiting for the answer she had asked for. Trump leaned forward slightly, his tone growing more intimate. "As I got older, life threw a lot of challenges my way. I faced losses, failures, and moments where I wasn't sure I could keep going. During those times, I didn't always feel like God was with me. Sometimes I was angry at him. Other times, I thought maybe he'd given up on me altogether." The room hung on his every word. This wasn't the polished rhetoric they were used to. This was raw, real. "But I'll tell you this," Trump said, his voice strengthening. "Even in my worst moments, when I thought I was alone, I realized something. Faith isn't about always having the answers. It's about believing that even when you can't see the whole picture, there's a purpose. There's something greater at work." He glanced back at Lily, whose small hands had loosened their tight grip on the Bible. Her wide eyes glistened under the fluorescent lights. "And God to me," he said, his words deliberate, "is that purpose. He's the reminder that even when we fall, even when we fail, we're not done. He's the one who keeps telling us to climb the ladder, even when it feels like it's going to break." The weight of his words hung in the air. For a moment, the room seemed suspended in time. Then, Lily's eyes welled up with tears. At first, a single drop slid down her cheek, but soon her shoulders began to tremble. The crowd stirred, whispering softly, sensing something extraordinary was unfolding. Her mother leaned in, placing a comforting hand on her back. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. But Lily shook her head. This wasn't sadness, it was something deeper. Trump's words had reached a part of her heart she hadn't known was there, and for the first time, it felt unguarded. Trump stepped away from the podium, his expression uncharacteristically gentle. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Lily," she stammered, her voice barely audible. "That's a beautiful name," he said, smiling faintly. "You know, Lily, sometimes the simplest questions are the hardest to answer. And sometimes, those questions remind us of what really matters." Lily nodded, her tear-filled eyes never leaving his. "My grandma used to say that too," she said softly. "She said God is always listening, even when you don't hear him." Trump's expression flickered, admiration mixed with an unspoken understanding. He took a deep breath and turned his attention back to the crowd. "You know, this little girl just asked a question that most adults are too afraid to ask," he said, his voice steady but reflective. "What does God mean to us?" It's not an easy question because it forces us to look inward. It makes us face our fears, our doubts, and our flaws. The room was utterly still, the weight of his words pressing down on everyone. For a moment, Lily wasn't just a little girl with a Bible. She was a symbol of something much larger. Her courage had shifted the tone of the evening, transforming it from a routine town hall into a deeply personal reflection on faith and humanity. Trump continued, his voice softer but resolute. "We live in a world where we're always looking for answers outside of ourselves. We think power, success, or money will fill the gaps, but they don't. The real answers are the ones that make us uncomfortable, the ones that force us to ask, what do I stand for? What do I believe in? And who am I when no one else is looking? He paused, his gaze returning to Lily. Thank you for reminding me of that, Lily, he said. You're wiser than most adults I know. The crowd erupted into soft applause, but Lily seemed not to notice. Her tears had stopped, replaced by a look of quiet pride. She wiped her cheeks with the sleeve of her dress and looked up at her mother, who smiled at her with glistening eyes of her own. As the applause subsided, Trump's tone shifted, hinting that the conversation was far from over. The room grew quieter still, as though the very air itself was waiting for what he would say next. Trump shifted slightly at the podium, his eyes scanning the crowd before settling back on Lily. His expression carried a heaviness, a weight that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than politics or public life. When I was a young man, Trump began, his voice softer now, there was a time I thought I had it all figured out. I had ambition, plans, and the drive to succeed. But there was one moment in my life, just one, that made me realize how little control I actually had. He paused, letting the words settle in the room. The crowd leaned forward, their curiosity palpable. Trump rarely opened a window into his personal life, but now it seemed he was about to. My brother, Fred, he continued, he was one of the kindest, most genuine people I've ever known. He had a light about him, a goodness I couldn't fully understand at the time. But Fred struggled. He had his demons, and no matter how much my family and I tried to help him, it wasn't enough. Trump's voice faltered for a moment, and he cleared his throat before continuing. When he passed away, I was angry. Angry at him, angry at myself, and angry at God. I couldn't understand why someone so good, someone with so much potential, had to leave this world so soon. Lily's gaze remained fixed on him, her young face etched with an expression far wiser than her age. Around the room, others looked equally captivated, their expressions a mix of empathy and intrigue. For a long time after that, Trump said, his voice quieter, I turned away from God. I thought, if he's real, why would he let that happen? Why would he take someone like Fred and leave me behind? He exhaled deeply, his hand gripping the edge of the podium. But then something changed. I don't know if it was a dream or just a memory, but one night, I saw Fred's face in my mind. He was smiling, this big, goofy smile he always had, and I heard him say, Don't be angry, Don. You've got work to do. The room was silent, the weight of his words pressing on them like a physical presence. Even the faint sounds of cars passing outside seemed to fade into nothingness. The noise in the room seemed to vanish, leaving only Trump's voice and the collective beating of hearts. I realized then, he said, his voice steadying, that faith isn't about understanding everything. It's about trusting that there's a reason, even when you can't see it. And maybe, just maybe, Fred's purpose was to teach me that. He turned back to Lily, his expression softening. So when you ask me what God means to me, I'll say this. He's the reason I keep going even when it's hard. He's the reminder that we're here for more than just ourselves. And he's the one who gives us hope, even in the darkest times. Lily's eyes shimmered again, but this time her tears didn't fall. Instead, she stood a little taller, clutching her grandmother's Bible with both hands, as though it were the most precious thing in the world. Just as the room seemed to settle into the gravity of his story, someone in the audience raised their hand, breaking the silence and pulling everyone's attention in a new direction. A man near the back of the hall stood slowly, his rugged face lined with years of hard work bearing a serious expression. He was the kind of person you might pass on the street without a second thought. A mechanic, a father, maybe someone who attended church sporadically when life allowed. His voice, however, cut through the stillness like a bell. Mr. Trump, he said, his words measured and deliberate, I've spent years trying to figure out my own faith. Hearing you talk about it like this, about anger, doubt, and hope, it makes me wonder if all of us have been too afraid to admit we're struggling. Do you think that's part of the problem? The question seemed to catch Trump off guard, but he didn't hesitate for long. He leaned slightly on the podium, his gaze meeting the man's. You know, he began, I think a lot of us are afraid to admit we're not as strong as we want people to think we are. Faith isn't easy. It's messy, it's complicated, and sometimes it feels like you're just shouting into the void. But the truth is, that's what makes it so powerful. It's not about being perfect, it's about trying even when you don't have all the answers. The man nodded, his expression softening as he sat back down. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Then, Lily's voice broke through, clear and steady despite her small frame. My grandma used to say faith is like planting seeds. You don't always see them grow right away, but you have to believe they will. Trump smiled, a genuine, almost tender expression that seemed to transform his usually guarded demeanor. Your grandma sounds like a very wise woman, he said. And she's right. Faith is a seed. It doesn't always sprout the way you expect, but that doesn't mean it's not there, growing in ways you can't see. The conversation seemed to breathe new life into the room. People began to nod, share glances, and whisper quietly to those sitting beside them. What had started as a structured town hall had shifted into something far more personal, a shared reflection on life's challenges, doubts, and moments of grace. An older woman, her silver hair pulled back into a neat bun, raised her hand next. I lost my husband last year, she said, her voice trembling. I've been angry at God ever since. I feel like I've lost my faith entirely. Do you think it's too late to find it again? Trump stepped closer to the edge of the stage, his voice soft but steady. It's never too late, he said. Faith isn't something you lose forever. It's something that waits for you. And sometimes, it's in the quietest moments, when you least expect it, that it comes back to you. The woman nodded, tears glistening in her eyes. Around the room, others looked equally moved, some dabbing at their faces with tissues, others simply sitting in reflective silence. As Trump's words settled into the hearts of everyone in the room, it became clear that the evening wasn't just about questions and answers anymore. It was about connection. What came next would only deepen that bond. The room felt electric, not with noise, but with a palpable energy of shared vulnerability. People who had arrived expecting a routine political talk found themselves part of something deeply personal. Lily's simple question had opened a door no one had dared approach before, and now no one wanted to turn back. Trump straightened, his gaze sweeping the room. You know, he began, there's something I've learned over the years. Faith doesn't always show up in grand moments. It's in the small ones, the times when someone lends a hand, listens when you're hurting, or asks a question as brave as Lily's. Those moments remind us of what matters. The audience was silent, hanging on every word. Trump's voice, so often commanding and unyielding, now carried a humility that struck a deep chord. He gestured toward Lily. This little girl reminded me tonight that faith isn't just something we talk about, it's something we live. And when we live it, it spreads. Lily smiled faintly, her cheeks still flushed. Her mother pulled her close, whispering something in her ear that made her smile widen just a little more. Trump's tone grew firmer. We're living in a time when it feels like the world is pulling us apart. Politics, opinions, differences. But faith has the power to bring us together. It's not about being the same. It's about understanding that we're all climbing that same ladder, one step at a time, no matter how different our paths might look. A ripple of applause began, slow at first, but gaining momentum. People stood, clapping not just for Trump but for the moment itself, for the courage it had taken Lily to ask her question, and for the answers it had drawn out of everyone in the room. As the applause subsided, Trump leaned into the microphone one last time. So tonight, I'll leave you with this. Ask yourselves what faith means to you. And don't be afraid of the answer, no matter how uncertain it might be. Because faith isn't about knowing, it's about believing. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle, before adding, and if you found something tonight that touched you, hold on to it. Let it grow. Share it with the people who need it most. The room erupted in applause again, but this time it was punctuated with hugs, handshakes, and even a few tears. Strangers who had entered the hall with little more than polite nods now lingered, exchanging smiles and stories. It was as if a collective weight had been lifted, replaced by a quiet hope. Lily, now standing with her mother, watched as Trump stepped away from the podium. He walked over to her, kneeling slightly so they were eye to eye. "Thank you, Lily," he said, his voice low but sincere. "You've got more courage than most people twice your age. Don't ever lose that." She nodded, her small hand extending to shake his. "Thank you, Mr. Trump," she said, her voice steady now. "For answering." Trump stood, giving her a faint smile before turning back to wave at the crowd as he exited. The room remained alive with chatter, the people clearly changed by what had just unfolded. Lily looked up at her mother, her voice soft but determined. "Grandma would have been proud, wouldn't she?" Her mother smiled, tears welling in her eyes. "She would have been more than proud, sweetheart. She would have been amazed." As the hall slowly emptied, the lingering message was clear. Sometimes the bravest questions lead to the most unexpected answers. And in those answers, we find pieces of ourselves we didn't know were missing.